question for the whole group. So storytellers often have to take shortcuts and can't always be scientifically accurate in the storytelling. What did the film get right? What impressed you? What did they get right in the story? Let's start there.
They got right how inefficient wolves are at hunting. They depend on each other as pack members to successfully take game.
I study how predators use the landscape to their advantage when hunting, so how they can use the terrain in ways that make them more successful when they're hunting different kinds of prey. So maybe one or two of those hunt scenes might have been using some sneaking up and using rough terrain to their advantage, but yeah, it was fun.
So I really enjoyed the movie. So let's talk about domestication. And so domestication took place over a long period of time. We had an hour-and-a-half film. Can you talk about the differences between wolves and dogs and how wolves became dogs?
Well, that's a really pithy subject. From what we understand now, the gray wolf is the ancestor to most dogs, not necessarily all dogs, but their pack structure is similar, and it's one of the reasons why they like us and live in our homes and have a cooperation as part of their lexicon. That was a German Shepherd. You guys know that, right? That was a really cool German Shepherd, and some animation because they couldn't get him to snarl at him. But he's a lovely shepherd. So physically, there are a lot of similarities, but there's so many differences. Selective breeding, we've selected against the characteristics that make wolves survive. And so what we know now is there are no feral dog populations or domestic dog populations, unferal, that are capable of hunting and surviving on their own. The one thing that they know they can do is count on taking cues from humans for food, and that they are excellent at, and they're better at it than wolves, as we find with our research with University of Arizona and Duke. So I'm sure there's much more to talk about.
Yeah, I think you make a really good point about selective breeding over time, and I think that's really what makes or distinguishes our domestic dog from our wolves, in that we have over time selected for traits that allow them to live very successfully alongside of us, and that's not something that has been passed along or that hasn't evolved necessarily with wolves. So yeah, just wanted to reiterate that one.
I think my dogs hunt kibble in a very different way than wolves hunt. Not really my area.
So the movie also had hyenas. Can you talk about how hyenas or foxes are different than wolves or dogs?
Oh, they're completely different. Hyenas aren't even in the same family. Foxes are family Canidae, but they're not genus species. They're not genus Canis. So they're not, they're very, very different. And we even, the coyote is a very different animal than the wolf. One of the things that's a little tricky is that any member of the family genus Canis can breed and bear live, viable young. So and we have different, but they're still different species. So that kind of trips up our understanding of what a species is. So behaviorally, wolves and dogs couldn't be more different. And hyenas, that was a great touch to have hyenas in there. Hyenas are, you know way more about hyenas than we do, so I just didn't know whether, they got the weather thing wrong, they got the time of year thing wrong. But everybody, so talk about the hyenas.
I actually don't have that much to say about hyenas.
All right. So let's talk about the wolves in Minnesota. It's a controversial topic. The impact, the role they play in ecosystems, the impact on farmers and deer populations. Let's start with maybe the role of the keystone predator and the positive effects. Starting with you, Meredith, some of the research you've done. Wolves were reintroduced in Yellowstone. They have a huge impact on ecosystems. You can talk about that.
Sure. Yeah. So when I think about how predators impact ecosystems, there's really two ways that they can do that. They can do that consumptively by eating other animals, which is what predators do. So removing members of deer populations and elk populations and caribou populations, and changing the demography, like the number of these prey animals obviously has effects on how many elk and deer are out there browsing and eating things and trampling the ground and causing erosion and affecting all kinds of different processes in an ecosystem. But wolves can also, and this is what I specialize in, is how wolves scare other animals. So I study what's called a landscape of fear. And the idea there, great name, right? The idea there is that wolves, there's certain parts of the landscape, like I said, where wolves are really just on point. Like their hunting success goes through the roof, where there's other parts of the landscape where they just can't hunt as well. So if animals like deer, if they can get into the water, wolves can't get them. So across the landscape, you have these different hotspots of really dangerous areas for prey. And you also have times of day too, like wolves don't run around 24/7, sometimes they're asleep, so there's some times of day that are scarier or safer than others. So you have this predation risk across a landscape that isn't static. And so prey animals have to sort of navigate how they perceive how risky a habitat is. And so that changes where they are and what they're doing at different times of day, at different seasons, at different times of the month. And so that also concentrates all of that sort of browsing and grazing and the effects that herbivores have on ecosystems into very specific locations. So in Yellowstone, ooh, that got loud. In Yellowstone, we didn't have wolves for 100 years, and people believe that the herbivore populations got out of control. There was a lot of browsing on certain tree species, a lot of erosion into the river systems that affected habitat types for everything from fishes and amphibians to songbirds. And then you put wolves back in, and elk suddenly are spending a lot more time watching out for wolves. They're not going into areas that they consider particularly scary. So not only do you have fewer herbivores going around eating things, destroying habitat for other animals, but they're also doing it in very concentrated parts of the landscape, and that allows these other parts of the landscape time to regenerate and get back to a space that creates all of this really good heterogeneity for other species. So that would be, some of that's controversial. We're still figuring out exactly to what degree all of these changes are caused by top predators like wolves. But that's one of the hypotheses for how they could positively affect different sorts of ecosystems.
That's great. Peggy, do you want to talk about the impact in Minnesota with deer population and impact on farmers?
Well, contrary to popular belief, wolves are not wiping out the deer in Minnesota, and that frustrates me that you can hunt in Minnesota without taking any kind of hunter education. I think it should be mandatory. But there are areas where they can impact local deer populations. And we also have, one of the things I really liked about this film was that they had a landscape with a complex predator system. There were lots of predators on the landscape, and that was really cool. In Minnesota, we do have a more complex predator system than a lot of our other areas in the lower 48. So we have this new player on the scene when it comes to impact on deer, and that's coyotes. So, let's talk about wolves and deer versus wolves and moose. There are some studies now that are showing that, first of all, our moose are changing anyway, but wolves can impact moose in a different way because they're not dependent on them as a food source the way they are dependent on deer. So when it comes to deer populations, the wolves wax and wane, and some of the theories about why the wolf she's studying in Cedar Creek got there is because the deer population was lower, and the deer that survive these harsh winters are super deer and are less vulnerable to wolves. So we saw range expansion that we had never seen before, at least not in a long, long time, certainly not in my lifetime. And so we saw some wolves going places that we'd never seen them before, and some of them set up shop in Cedar Creek. So they definitely, when it comes to deer, they are about a couple years behind in terms of their population. So especially in the 90s, in the late 90s, when we had 95, 96, 96, 97, we had these record winter severity index. The first year, lots and lots of deer died. The second year, very few radio-collared deer died. So, and then we had these mild winter stretch, and the super deer that survived the last mild severe winter had super babies, and there was many fewer vulnerable deer, and we saw wolf populations dip. So when we see fewer vulnerable deer, there's another issue on the landscape that we see an increase in, and that's impact on the stuff we don't want them to eat, and that includes livestock. So it's not a huge issue in terms of money. There are 8,000, 9,000 farms that have wolves on them and around them that never get any impact. So between 1 and 2% of the farms have any impact. But for an individual producer, it can be a huge deal. These people live with very narrow margins for income, and it doesn't take very many cattle being taken for that to really negatively impact them. We actually got some orphan puppies from western Minnesota last year. We were given permission by the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service to go trap them after their parents moved out to western Minnesota, where there used to be bison and other prey, appropriate prey, and promptly killed 6 cow calves. And the adults were euthanized, and we were given the opportunity to go and catch the puppies. So it's very real. It's a real issue, and it's handled very well in Minnesota. So.
That's great. So you mentioned moose. So Tiffany, you've studied moose quite a bit. Can you talk about the relationship between moose and wolves and the threats to the moose population in Minnesota?
Yeah, so a lot of my work is up in Grand Portage, Minnesota. So if any of you don't know where that is, it's the farthest northeast corner of Minnesota. And there's actually a pretty high density of wolves around Grand Portage. And I work on a tribal reservation. So there's collaring of moose there, there's collaring of deer, and there's collaring of wolves. And our biologists are keeping a pretty close eye on how these populations are fluctuating over time. We've been studying moose, the decline of moose, alongside what the DNR has been doing for the past almost a decade now. And what we're finding is we do see high levels of predation of our adults, so wolves will kill adult moose. We're learning more and more that a lot of these moose, the adult moose that they're killing, have been unhealthy. It's much easier to kill or hunt sick moose than a healthy adult moose, but they're really wreaking havoc on our calves. So we haven't seen a high level of calves recruited into adult cohorts, and that is primarily because of high levels of predation. But Peggy mentioned that we do have a complex predator system. Wolves aren't the only ones to blame. Black bears take a lot of moose calves as well. But we, as whitetail deer are moving further into moose regions of Minnesota, Peggy also made a really good point. Our wolves are successfully, are doing very well. Their populations seem to fluctuate in response to deer populations. When it comes to our moose calves, unfortunately, when our wolves are doing successfully, these our moose calves are the first and most vulnerable calves out on the landscape. So they're born about a month before deer fawns are born. And so they're the most vulnerable prey items on the landscape, and unfortunately that means easy pickings for both wolves and bears. So we have seen a pretty high impact on calves. Actually, the last 2 years has been fairly good, and I feel like I should knock on wood for saying that, because I don't want to change this positive trends, but that's where we are. I would not say that wolves are the only thing to blame for our moose decline. So please don't mistake that. In fact, I'm launching more research to study disease in relation to what's being transmitted from white-tailed deer rather than studying the impact of wolves.
Okay, that's great. So the Wildlife Science Center, again, I want to put it in a plug. It's fantastic. Check it out. The wolves you have there, Peggy, can you play with them like the child plays with the wolf in this movie, or go hunting with the wolves? Would that work?
No, and I have to say, I have to introduce my daughter. She's 19, and she's in the back there. She was bawling away, but we were also chuckling. No. So yeah, and no, and we hand raise a lot of wolves, and the wolves that we get, we don't accept from private individuals. People think they have wolves, and they have a really beautiful sable shepherd. So the wolves that we get are all from agencies that oftentimes either they are eating something they're not supposed to eat, or their parents are, or in some cases in northern British Columbia, we got some puppies that were part of a culling project where they had satellite collars on the adults, and they were culling the puppies to see if they could lower the wolves' impact on woodland caribou. So that's how we get our animals, which is one of the reasons we work with behavior scientists, because there are lots of facilities in this country that have wolves that have no wild genetic introgression. So the animals are very different than ours. And you can, without even meaning to, and there are a couple of facilities that do this intentionally, they breed for nice wolves. And they get nice wolves. And so I don't have nice wolves. I have wolves. And so they, the most important difference is their neophobia, their fear of people. When you mentioned a fearful landscape, one of the things that I can't speak to 20,000 years ago, but in 150 years of keeping track, we have a very large gray wolf population in North America, and there are only 2 cases of human fatality in the wild. That doesn't mean that it's without danger. And one of the control efforts that happens in Minnesota is when we have a tolerant wolf, a wolf that does not show fear of people. That isn't tolerated very long. So, but the landscape, there are many more situations where people see wolves and feel the fear rather than actually are in danger. So, coyotes are incredibly resourceful and adaptable. And there are actually studies that look at urban coyotes in Chicago that they're more successful than rural coyotes. And you do get a great difference in their response to people. The closer they live to human beings, the more comfortable they are. And yes, they eat cats, which I love cats, but secretly as a biologist, it's the price that you keep your cat inside, because cats also impact songbirds. Dogs on leash are not vulnerable. Dogs off leash are vulnerable. Generally speaking, a golden retriever would be a pretty big animal for them to take. However, there was, in Coon Rapids, there was a black lab attacked by coyotes. So, and in fact, in Denver, we had the first case of an adult man being attacked by coyotes. He didn't die. How insulting, be attacked by these 30-pound animals. So, difference between a wolf and a coyote. They're both gray and they have pointy ears and they vocalize kind of like a howl, and that's about where the similarities end. So wolves are obligatory pack hunters. They are much less successful when they don't have a pack. They are they're very, very hormonally geared to parent, and coyotes are not so much. There's much higher infanticide in coyotes than there is in wolves. Coyotes can either hunt in pairs or hunt solitarily, or they are now, some of them pack up more than they used to. Their coyotes have a smell like a fox does, and wolves do not. Wolves, if you ever deal with wolves, they have no oil in their skin like dogs do. They are clean. They don't smell at all. They smell almost perfumey, or they smell kind of like the landscape, the cedar, etc. So coyotes are just far more bold animal, far more adaptable. They eat strawberries out of strawberry fields, and they can eat grasshoppers, and we don't see that kind of diversity with wolves at all. Wolves are far more locked into eating these large prey, and their populations are linked to the consumption of these large prey. They're incredibly curious, and we don't respond in a way that hazes coyotes at all. Go on YouTube, and there's this fabulous footage of a coyote walking into a deli in Chicago, and no one chased him out, so he started to eat. Like, okay.
So what about, as a follow-up, the coyote-wolf hybrids or dog-wolf hybrids? What sort of behavior do you see in the hybrids, and how prevalent are they?
Well, first of all, dog-wolf hybrids are an artifact of captivity. It's like a liger. We do not have evidence in areas where wolves have the option of mating with wolves that wolves mate with dogs. It doesn't happen, and there's all kinds of myths and rumors about it. So they just don't. They eat dogs, and that's one of the things that I'm sure you both have experienced in your studies. And it became more of a problem the last few years because they're struggling to find food, and we really do not manage our dogs very well. It's around Cedar Creek. That's one of the things that got these wolves into trouble. People move out into the suburbs and they think they can just, well, we're out in the country now, we can let our dogs run. Well, guess what? There's a wolf pack now in Cedar Creek, and they were eating dogs. So, but wolf-dog mixes, behaviorally, these two species, dogs and wolves, are separated by 20,000 years of selective breeding in the opposite direction. Dogs can't eat 30 pounds of food at once without getting sick. Wolves can. They can't tolerate most of the postmortem bacteria that you find in the animals that wolves eat. It makes them sick. They can't eat salmonella. It makes them sick. Wolves can eat salmonella. They're walking vultures because they don't have an option. They have incredibly strong microbes in their bellies, and they can eat just about anything. So the wolf-dog mix is an unknown. And I I do not believe that we have DNA labs in private industry that have enough of a known database of wild wolves to be able to take a blood sample from your dog and tell you whether or not it has wolf in it. And it's a scam, and it's frustrating. There's one lab in the country, the U.S. Department of Agriculture, that has consolidated wild known origin wolf samples, and there's a geneticist there that does a fantastic job. And there are in other agencies as well, but not in the private sector. So just because it looks wolfy like that lovely sable shepherd doesn't mean it is a wolf. Coyote wolf hybrids, they don't exist in Minnesota. They don't happen on the landscape in Minnesota. They certainly don't happen out west where wolves and coyotes live sympatrically. There is some evidence that there's a separate species of wolf called the eastern wolf. This is really complicated. They will hybridize with coyotes. That's the canid bridge between the coyote and the gray wolf. Gray wolves do not hybridize with coyotes. Eastern wolves will hybridize with coyotes, and eastern wolves will hybridize with gray wolves. So it's canid soup. I mean, in terms of dominance, when you take that to mean dominance, what happened in Yellowstone with the coyotes? They wiped out what?
Yeah, so in Yellowstone, when the wolves go away, you get something called mesopredator release. So all of those animals, these smaller carnivores that wolves typically kind of keep under control is the wrong phrase. But essentially, yeah, they eat. They take food away from these guys. As soon as the wolves are done, their populations explode and they become the dominant predators. You get wolves back in and you get suppression, again, of some of these smaller animals. So when you don't have wolves, you have coyotes running around eating more of the things that you would have wolves eat. Yeah, and their populations aren't regulated by these apex predators. And then wolves come back in and you have competition again between these different predators. You have wolves eating coyotes, and the populations of the mesopredators of these coyotes and foxes and smaller things go back down again.
I think in terms of presence on the landscape, coyotes are wildly successful. Canada geese and coyotes are going to survive whatever we do. So, oh my God, we keep yeah, rabbits. So I think in terms of dominance, 25% of the coyotes in Yellowstone or something like that were wiped out by wolves, and there's video available. But in terms of dominance on the landscape, coyotes, we have a conservative estimate for coyote population in Minnesota is about 100,000 coyotes. And we have between 2,000 and 3,000 wolves. So they're completely different, and their impact on deer continues to change. And so 10 years ago, a conservative estimate of impact was two deer per coyote, which is 200,000 deer. And it's much different than that now. Coyotes are learning about fawning, and they're behaving in a different way. As you mentioned, they flew below the radar of the Department of Agriculture until after 1915, because they didn't cross the Mississippi, and they didn't hunt livestock. They were literally the rabbit dog, and that's what they pursued. That's a thing of the past. So what we do at the Wildlife Science Center when we allow breeding, and we do this because when we allow breeding, because the most important reason is because we use our animals as models for the Mexican wolf. Everything that's done to a Mexican wolf is tested first on these animals that we have that have been removed from other areas of the world that are never going to be released, and their ancestors are never going to be released. The Mexican wolf was reduced in numbers to 7 in 1979. So everything that's done to them is tested extensively first. And the most important things we do are looking at ways to temporarily stop breeding, like contraceptives, or increase breeding success. So we test those first on the other animals. So when we allow breeding, it's part of that context. And when we have puppies, we use some of the puppies for this research that's been going on for years with Duke University, Dr. Brian Hare, and at University of Arizona, Dr. Evan McLean. They have been looking at everything from oxytocin levels in wolf puppies compared to dogs, decision-making with little tidbits of food, all kinds of really cool behavior things. And in order to do that, you have to have them comfortable with you.
And that hormone is the bonding hormone.
Bonding. Oh, oxytocin is the love hug hormone.
Right.
So our dogs produce more of it than we do. When we look at them, they love us more than we do, which I don't believe. I think I love my dog. So I've raised wolves for many years, and what we have found is that with a dog in the process, they do better. Dogs, and it has to be the right dog. The Siberian Huskies kind of surprised us because we haven't had success with Huskies. We have a shepherd that he is amazing. He literally, when they're infants, they need to be stimulated to urinate and defecate. He does that. He cares for them, cleans them, disciplines them. He's heartbroken right now because we gave them to adult wolves. And so, yeah, he sits and stares in the wolf enclosure. So, but the Siberian Husky is like a big sibling to them, and it works very well. When they're afraid, they look for an adult, and when that's certainly what happens with wolves in the wild. Adults will go hunting and leave their puppies back at a rendezvous site because puppies don't go hunting until they're bigger, and then they will wait for the adults to come back, and when they see the adults, oh, everything's fine, everything's safe. So that's why we use the puppy.
That's great.
Decide.
So I think we have time for one more quick, and we have to wrap up. Right here.
Yeah, I had another question about scientific accuracy or lack thereof in the film.
Don't diss the film. It's a great little film.
I mean, good.
It's a beautiful film.
No, it's a beautiful film.
Yeah, it had to do with the title. I thought I heard that wolves actually don't have alphas, or at least not in the wild. It's a artifact of captivity. Is that true, false? Can any of you speak to that, or?
It's not, well, we used to consider there's an alpha male and an alpha female and then the beta and all that stuff. Those terms are less important. However, there still is in the wild, there is, especially in Minnesota, a breeding pair. And I think what we fantasize about is how permanent that pack structure is. It isn't. It's a very fluid kind of dynamic. So there's a breeding pair, and generally speaking, they don't breed until they're 3 years of age in Minnesota. And then the pack composition is the young of the year and sometimes yearlings from the year before. But Dave Meach has documented 100% turnover in 5 years or fewer. They don't just hang out together. And dispersal from your pack can happen as young as 10 months of age. And even earlier sometimes. So it isn't this nuclear family that we like to think of it as. And in captivity, they don't have the option of dispersal. And so we mitigate, wolves are very hard on each other. It's one of the leading causes of death for wolves is other wolves. So we mitigate that by keeping everybody healthy. So, but it's a messy thing.
So I'm going to assume that we have to wrap up. But can you stick around and ask some questions in person if you'll walk up after the screen?
Absolutely.
All right. I want to thank everyone for coming out tonight and the panelists. Can we have a round of applause for our panelists? Thanks for sticking around. If you like, again, great stories, great science, please go to the Northstar Science Film Festival Facebook page, Twitter account, our website, follow us, hear about advanced screenings, and come to our festival. Thanks for coming, everyone.
Thank you.